Thank you so much, Selena. Thank you so much, Josh, for inviting me to do this, for trusting me. It's anytime I'm being trusted with people's learning experiences, it's such an honor. And I feel ever so grateful to be in community with all of you and, to continue building in this way. And I'm super excited to be here and to share with you today. So thank you for showing up on a Saturday morning. It's not easy. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Candy Gonzalez. I am a West Philly-based multidisciplinary artist and trauma-informed educator. I usually start off my introduction by reminding people or letting people know that I'm a Gemini and I am the perfect Gemini, and I like to do 100 things all at the same time. And so, I, even though my training is in book arts and printmaking, also do a little bit of poetry, a little bit of photography, one finger in as many pies as I can get them into, right? And trauma-informed work is relatively new for me. I've been doing it for a couple of years now. And, it really stemmed from me realizing how much support people needed before the pandemic. And then I just happened to really settle into this journey at the very beginning of the pandemic and realizing, oh, I have tools that I can use to support folks in the spaces that I facilitate, whether it's my classrooms or, whether I'm co-facilitating or organizing with other people, right? So it's become really important for me to share this knowledge with as many people as possible, right? Because I've come to realize I'm one human and my access is limited, right? I want as many people to be impacted by this kind of information as possible. So, thank you for being here and taking this in, and thank you so much for taking it into your communities, because more people are going to be touched through you. And so I really appreciate that. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have a lot for us today, and I will try my best to, get us to the end. All right. But I would like to at least get to hear a little bit from folks who are in the room. So I'm going to invite you all to drop this in the chat box. I would love to know your name, your pronouns, and I want you to spend some time thinking about what color your heart is today. If you could grab a crayon and fill out that heart shape, how would you fill that out? Folks, thank you so much for sharing a little bit. I wish we had more time to just open up and talk and really dive in, but the goal is to get us to the end. So thank you for indulging me at least in this little bit. And then also Kirsten, my heart is royal purple today. Thank you for ending us on that note and letting us feel regal with you. So appreciate that. I'm just going to go over a quick overview. We did our quick introductions. I'm going to go over some community agreements. And just know that as I go over these things, I will also explain how I use them in the spaces that I facilitate. So, I will encourage you all to use community agreements in your own work. I'll talk about trauma, where we'll elaborate on trauma. We'll do some brain breaks, we'll do some check-ins, and then I'll get more into facilitation. So for community agreements is a way in which you can set the tone of the spaces that you're facilitating, of the groups that you're facilitating. Usually when you're meeting with a group for the first time, you don't know everybody, right, intimately. It takes time to build relationships with people. So you may not know people's needs yet, right? And the first few moments of meeting with a group are critical, right? It's how you set the tone. So usually introductions are a part of that, obviously, right? Even as people are walking in, that's certainly a part of that. But also community agreements is an explicit and clear way of setting standards for how you expect folks to participate and engage. It creates some clarity, which tends to put people at ease, right? I go to my favorite quote from Brene Brown: "Clear is kind, unclear is unkind." And so I often find that community agreements bring clarity to spaces. Now that I've kind of set the context for community agreements, I will also set them with you. Above all, it's important for you to respect yourself and respect others. Respect this virtual space. We're only here for a short amount of time. Honor your body, right? That's a way that you respect yourself. You honor your body and you take care of yourself. So if at any moment you feel like you need to turn off your camera, if you need to step away, however you need to care for yourself, you're welcome to do that, right? And I will support you in that. I ask you to be as present as possible while knowing that there's a lot that is happening outside of the four walls that each of us are currently in. I want to acknowledge that we're still in the middle of a global pandemic. And though things feel like we're kind of coming over the hump, there's mixed signals every day. And that is anxiety inducing. So, as much as possible, remind yourself to be present while also not putting the pressure on yourself when you feel like yourself drifting away. So there's a balance that can be found there. I invite you to have an open mind and an open heart. A lot of this information will be new for some folks. It's hard to take in. Talking about trauma is never easy. And for me personally, there's a tension where I enjoy talking about it in a technical aspect. I enjoy talking about the applications of trauma-informed work. And as somebody who is trauma impacted, it is difficult, right? So this kind of leads us to the last point in a way. I invite you to enjoy yourself if you are finding enjoyment in learning, in this learning experience, in sharing this space, in finding clarity, right? There is enjoyment in that, and that is welcome. And there's no room for shame there, right? And also, want to acknowledge that some of this information is hard. So as much as you're able, definitely welcome you to stay open. And ask questions, ask for what you need. That's literally my job. It's why I'm here. To the best of my abilities, I will always try to meet you where you are. And if there's, a gap in knowledge for me or something like that, I'm pretty good at being honest with you, or I'm pretty good at saying, hey, I can come back to you with a good answer, right? So please ask me to repeat myself, ask me to slow down, whatever it is that you're needing, put that out there. Does anybody have anything they'd like to add? Or please, this is also yours, and I invite you all to contribute to this. Know that you are welcome to throw things in the chat box at any time. So if at some point you're like, I need this to be a part of our community agreements, that will be honored. I'm going to invite us to work on a 2-minute safety plan. So what is a safety plan? A safety plan is kind of a predetermined strategy plan for you to identify how you will care for yourself while you're in a calm or relatively calm state, so that if you feel triggered by any of the information that I shared today, you're able to use that plan as a way to care for yourself in the moment. There's many ways in which you can do a safety plan. This is a boiled down 2-minute safety plan, given, like our time constraint. That being said, usually I can spend up to 30 minutes, an hour working through safety plans with people. At its core, it's really just a strategy that is predetermined before you even get into the nitty gritty of the information that will allow people to consider how will you care for yourself if you were to be triggered, or if your emotional state is to, be excited and overwhelmed. So as a part of the 2-minute safety plan, I'm gonna ask you to think of one thing that you will do to self-soothe if you begin to feel overwhelmed during this workshop, something that is attainable in the moment, like I have fidgets or little toys around that help me find grounding, whether it's turn off your computer or turn off your camera or whatever it is. Take a minute to just think about that and write it down. All right. I'm gonna move on, and I invite you to use the idea of safety plans in your own work when you're out in the community. This idea of the safety plan was born from a trauma-informed social worker. Her name is Sandra Bloom, and wrote Creating Sanctuary and Destroying Sanctuary and all of these great books about how to apply trauma-informed modalities to different systems, and invite you to check her work out. So now that we've put our safety plan together, let's dive in. I want us to define, or I'm going to share some definitions of trauma just to set the context and also for us to all be on the same page, because our ideas of trauma, of course, are subjective. They're based on our own lives and experiences, and that actually is the nature of trauma itself. But I do want to share some definitions that have been brought forth by people in the field. So I'm going to start off with a definition from the Center for Nonviolence and Social Justice, which says that trauma is experiences or situations that are emotionally painful and distressful and that overwhelm people's ability to cope, leaving them feeling powerless. And the book Trauma and Recovery, which is an excellent resource, and definitely also I'm going to redirect you there if you want to read more and learn more, says that traumatic events are extraordinary, not because they occur rarely, but because they overwhelm the ordinary human adaptations to life. I'm going to repeat that because there's a lot there to unravel. So traumatic events are extraordinary, not because they occur rarely, right? There's a study called the ACEs study, which is called Adverse Childhood. It's an acronym for Adverse Childhood Experiences, which was done actually on predominantly white communities. So, if you consider what the impact is in white communities compared to communities who are oppressed due to systems like of racism and all of that, then you can even raise that number. But through the ACEs study, they found that over 60% of people had at least one traumatic experience as a kid, and at least 40% or more had more than one. So it's a lot to take in, because again, going back to this definition, traumatic events, they occur pretty frequently, right? What creates the trauma, right? It's not necessarily the event, but how they impact the human who experienced that, right? How that event was processed, whether the person has found reconciliation, right? Or acceptance, or, closure. And I will expand more on that in a second, because for our kind of work, it's important to consider how trauma manifests on the body, and it really comes down to understanding that trauma doesn't necessarily exist in the event, but in the person, in the human person that lives through that event. Trauma aware is the degree to which someone is aware that trauma is a reality for many people, right? Trauma sensitive is when we are intentional in the way that one interacts with someone they know or suspect has experienced a significant trauma. And that could be at many levels. Trauma competent is the degree to which a person is capable of effectively integrating trauma-informed skills into a specific situation to better understand the situation and respond to it. And then trauma-informed is we move on from talking about interpersonal applications of trauma-informed models to systemic applications, right? So me as an individual who has gone through trauma-informed training, you know, I would be considered a trauma competent professional, and the services that I provide for folks are trauma-informed services. So just want to make sure that I clarify that distinction. Trauma-informed services are designed to accommodate the vulnerabilities of trauma-impacted people and allow services to be delivered in a way that avoid inadvertent re-traumatization and will facilitate consumer participation in treatment, right? So the goal is always to avoid re-traumatizing the communities that we're working with. And I will get into, you know, how that may happen, you know, further into the presentation. And also, you know, I think about the importance of harm reduction, right? Because a lot of us, you know, the experiences have been had, the trauma has, you know, it exists in the body. And we also, while we're working towards avoiding further traumatization and re-traumatization, while we're working on, you know, dismantling some of the systems that create trauma, and, you know, we also need to think about harm reduction. And I believe that your trauma-informed modalities make space for that. Trauma-impacted person is a neutral term that is used to describe people who have in some way been impacted by trauma without calling them victims or survivors. When we use the words like victims or survivors, we're making a lot of assumptions about how the person perceives themselves, how they perceive their journey, and where they are on their healing journey. So I'm always going to encourage people to just say trauma impacted person, as, you know, as so that we don't lead with assumptions of the humans that we're working with without giving them an opportunity to share how they feel about their experiences. Any questions about the definitions that I shared with you so far? I want to go over the categories of trauma. And again, I share these, it's more of as a context, right? I will talk about how, you know, as facilitators, it's not necessarily our job to, you know, diagnose people or, you know, advise on treatment or anything like that. But I do find it helpful to at least set the context with folks, and I guess for you all to come in with a clear understanding before we talk about applications. So situational trauma, it's traumatic events that aren't perpetuated by other people that the person may already know. So, you know, I invite you to take a minute to think of maybe an example. Usually the example that I give is, you know, you're maybe driving to work and you have a car accident, right? You may not know the other person. And that car accident, for some people, that may cause trauma, and then for other folks, it may not. Relational trauma, it's interpersonal, right? So it's with people that you do know, relationships that already exist, whether they are familial, like with your family, whether they are professional, colleagues, with your boss, et cetera, friends, right? So platonic and non-platonic relationships. Acute, they are one-time traumatic events. So, you know, an example I can give is any of the natural disasters that have happened, and and where there has been loss. That's a thing, right? I would say, for example, like COVID and the pandemic is more, it's become more chronic trauma than acute. I think at first it might have been considered acute trauma. And then, the longer we sat in it, it became chronic trauma, which is, traumatic experiences that occur repeatedly. Allostatic load, the impact of ongoing chronic toxic stress. So it's the accumulation of all of these things that I'm mentioning. And lastly, complex trauma is when there's a variety of traumas making the overall impact even more difficult to assess and understand. So an example of complex trauma is for folks who exist with minoritized identities, then and have experienced any of these other, they experience complex trauma, right? So I always give myself as the example, right? As a brown, non-binary, queer human who has also experienced, some relational trauma, some etc. Like that, I would be the candidate for complex trauma, right? And I'm sure a lot of you are having a moment of like, whew, realization. So if that is you, I'm going to invite you to take a deep breath and remind you that your safety plans are there for you and that you're welcome to ask me for support as well. I want to expand our understanding of trauma by talking more about what I've already referenced, that trauma exists in the body and not necessarily in the event. And this is a definition that I came upon while reading Trauma Through a Child's Eyes. Such a great book, really easy to read as well. And if there's kiddos in your life or not, like I don't have kiddos necessarily, and I enjoyed it a lot. And it brought a lot of clarity. So I read this definition and I knew I had to share it with y'all. It says trauma happens when any experience stuns us like a bolt out of the blue. It overwhelms us, leaving us altered and disconnected from our bodies. Any coping mechanisms we may have are undermined. We feel utterly helpless and hopeless, and it is as if our legs are knocked out from under us. Trauma is the antithesis of empowerment. Trauma lives in the nervous system. I'm going to say that one more time. Trauma lives in the nervous system. Trauma lives in the body, right? That's what that means, that trauma lives in the body and not necessarily in the event. What I really love about this definition is how it gives us that sensory understanding of what trauma does to us, right? It's not, when we experience trauma, right, which is the impact of the events, it is literally stored in the parts of our brain that deal with sensory memory, with sensory information. And, we actually lose touch, like with what we call the executive functioning parts of the brain, right? The parts of our brain that deal with language, that deal with reasoning, with abstract thinking, right? We lose touch with that. Our brain is so interesting. It literally is, it's interesting. And also sometimes I'm like, why? But our brain kind of relegates different tasks to different parts, right? And so when you're in a calm state, when you're feeling good in your body, when everything's okay, or as okay as possible, the different parts of our brain are communicating clearly, and everything is running smoothly, and information is being transmitted super quickly, right? Because we don't even feel it, but like from one part to the other. So we're able to function in that way. When we experience an event that leaves traumatic impact, what happens, and we are triggered into fight, flight, freeze, or fawning, what happens is that our brain, the parts of our brain kind of lose touch, right? Like there might be static that is happening between the different parts, and they're not able to communicate clearly. And then specific parts of our brain then they're in charge of our survival, right? So for example, the part of our brain that we are born with, when we are born, it is the most developed. It's called, oof, did I just lose that? But it's literally, wow, I'm gonna need a second because I feel like I'm having an out of body experience right now. But the part of it's our brainstem. And so our brainstem is responsible for breathing, for sleeping, all of our basic physiological functioning. That's what our brainstem. And then our reptilian brain right after is also kind of in charge of our reactions and what happens when we are in survival mode, right? Our brain's main function is to survive always. And so as soon as we are triggered into survival mode, that's those parts of the brain are what take over. And those parts of the brain aren't necessarily like rational, right? They're more reactionary, and more reactive. And just to kind of bring it around, that's why this definition is super important for me to share. Because now that we're talking about trauma, we're talking about it in a very heady way, right? We're talking about these definitions and blah, blah, blah. But, trauma is like experiential. It's how we feel in our bodies, literally, how the memories of our experiences and all of the pain from those experiences, how they constrict our ability to live as full realized humans, right? Again, trauma is in the biology, not in the events. Does anybody have any questions about what I just shared with you all? Okay, so again, just want to reiterate some of the things that I shared. Behind each trigger response is a series of physiological effects that remain a part of the person's sensory memory until it is processed. An example that I give is that for those of us who watch SpongeBob, there is this episode where SpongeBob is being asked to he's being asked by Squidward to delete all the information in his brain that's not related to fine dining. And I'm just going to give you the visual. I can't show you because I tried that before and I got blocked. But the point of it is that, we get this shot of SpongeBob's brain and it's all of these filing cabinets, right? And when he deleted the information that he was asked to delete, he deleted it. And so all those files got thrown away. And then there's this moment where he's asked for his name and, he can't find it. So he starts getting really stressed. He has a breakdown, and then all the filing cabinets combust, right? I love that 2-minute segment because when I saw it after having some of this training, I was like, wait, that is our brain, right? The way that our brain processes all information from the moment that we are born is that it kind of there's kind of like these filing cabinets of all of our first experiences, our first hug, the first words, the first books, everything that comes after is kind of filed away based on those first experiences. What happens with trauma and the events that cause trauma is that there's no filing cabinet for it, right? And so our brains are literally stuck. They're like, how do we make sense of this? And it is that the not being able to make sense of it that really can create a lasting impact. Trauma is etched into the most primal fear zones of the brain. So the brainstem and the reptilian brain, which is also called the midbrain, the two parts of our brain that are the most developed when we're born, those are the fear zones. And so, when a person experiences trauma, they're feeling it, they're not thinking it. And not only are most traumas invisible, many traumas remain dormant until triggered, right? So oftentimes, like, we'll put them away, and then we hear something, we smell something, we see a color, maybe a landscape that might remind us of that event, and then that is the trigger, and that will trigger a fear response. An example that I read in this book called The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog by Bruce Perry. I highly encourage folks to read this book. Again, super easy to read and also super rich in information. He was giving us an overview of a case study where somebody that he worked with personally, a Vietnam vet, right? And this person, came back, saw a lot of death, experienced a lot of loss, came back. He thought he was okay. He, got married, started a family, was working, was doing good. He thought he was like, safe from PTSD. And then for work, he moved to a place where the landscape was reminiscent of where he was deployed, right? And so as he would drive to work, what started happening is that he would start sweating, he would start hyperventilating, his mood was changing at home. And his wife eventually said, hey, you need to see somebody, you need to talk to somebody. And Bruce Perry, the clinician who was seeing him, didn't discover that he had been deployed for the Vietnam War until a few sessions in, because the person didn't think it was relevant, right? He didn't realize that, he was being triggered and that those memories were resurfacing. He thought, that happened over 18 years ago. I'm safe, like that's not an issue anymore. And, that was an example of, for us, as to what happens when traumas rely dormant until they don't. Any questions about what I just shared? So I do want to say that because trauma exists in the body, right? A lot of the times, the question that I get asked or that I hear being asked is, okay, so how do we cope? Like, how do we deal in the moment when we're having a panic attack, when we're, having a breakdown, whatever, right? And my answer is, you have to address the body as well, right? We think, oh, it's a mental health thing, so we address. No, like if you're addressing, what you're experiencing in your body, you're also addressing that, right? So neurosomatic regulation is the key to self and co-regulation. Neurosomatic regulation is literally just experiencing, like regulating what is happening in your body, right? If you're hyperventilating, might be a good idea to try some breath work. If you're feeling fidgety or, feeling restless, exercise, going for a walk, engaging your senses in some way. Maybe you wrap yourself in a weighted blanket, right? That is how you are regulating neurosomatically, because, we are one body, right? Like we're each one body. Our brain isn't separated from what's happening to us physically. And so usually what I encourage, folks who are facilitators to do is to consider how they introduce sensory experiences into those spaces. So, and it can be as simple as taking a sip of tea, taking a sip of water, coffee, anything that engages the taste buds, that engages our hands. So art, that is why art is like the perfect vehicle for, you know, healing and processing and resolving and finding closure, because we are engaging the senses. And if, you know, I want to take it back to when I said that, you know, trauma is stored in those parts of our brain that are sensory. You know, when we engage with those parts of our brain, we're able to, you know, find some reconciliation, right? So art, like whether it's mindless doodling, I love to do this exercise where I take deep breaths, and as I am breathing out, then I am just letting my hand move, and that's a way to draw my breath. So want to throw that out there, just a couple of techniques of, you know, things that you can do. All right, it's time for a brain break. So I'm going to stop sharing so that I can see everybody's beautiful faces. But I want to engage our brain and our bodies and make these connections of things that we've been talking about. So if you feel comfortable turning on your video, great. And if you don't,
should be good to go.
All right, thank you so much for engaging in that brain break with me. I love seeing people's reactions the first time they're asked to switch. And so it makes me happy to see so many smiles in the room. I want to bring in some information that I got through Lakeside Global Institute. So Lakeside Global Institute is based in Philly, and they are the organization through which I am becoming a trauma competent professional. They have all of these great resources. They've been working with social workers and educators in the greater Philadelphia area for a while now. And they've also just been working with clinicians and other professionals in the field for a while. So one thing that I learned from them that I share with, again, as many people who would listen, is the iceberg analogy. And so this iceberg, what it shows us, did I skip ahead? Oh, here we go. So what this reminds us is that the people that we are working with, our peers, even our own family and friends, right? But most certainly our colleagues, the communities that we serve, every individual you can think of as an iceberg, right? So what is above the surface is their outward behaviors. And sometimes those outward behaviors, it's, first of all, the only part that we can see. And second of all, it sometimes can be, there can be tension with us, right? There might be behaviors that affect us and we take personal. There might be behaviors that we place value judgment on, but we don't understand, right? And that this analogy reminds us that there's a lot that we don't see and that we don't know, particularly when we are working with communities where, you know, we're only working for a short period of time, or we're coming in for the first time. Think about the fact that we are coming in midstream of their life journey of, you know, we don't know what happened before. We certainly don't know what will happen in the future, right? And so first of all, it allows us to engage with compassion and empathy, because then we realize, okay, some of these behaviors, it's not about me, right? This doesn't say anything about me. You know, I know that I'm doing my best, and that this person might just need some support, and, you know, I will do what I can to the best of my abilities. And, you know, their level of receptivity, or like the behaviors that come out of that engagement, you know, actually have less to do with me than I realize. Below the surface, you know, there's emotional health that comes into play based on the relational health, which is even further down. So as humans, when we learn, as we're growing, it's all about relationships, right? Our relationship, our first relationship with our caretaker is incredibly important, right? Our relationship with our immediate community as kids, it's how we learn, right? We literally mimic each other's behaviors through something called mirror neurons that are in our brain that allow us to, one, feel empathy, and two, literally mimic other people's behaviors as a way of learning, right? Um, and then further up in the iceberg, it's the relational health that is the result of, the emotional health that is a result of the relational experiences or the relational health. So if those experiences have been positive, you might be confident, you might have a really strong sense of moral character. And if maybe there has been some struggles there, some tensions in that relational health, that might lead to low self-esteem, for example, right? Or a low sense of self. Um, Things to consider. But the point of this iceberg is that, when we're engaging with people, we don't necessarily know what's happening beneath the surface. And so if just having this in the back of your mind as a reminder might allow you to engage with patience and empathy in certain situations. So I do want to go over some examples of what the different parts of this iceberg is, and then, like what are some more specific example of outward behaviors, emotional health, relational health. I want to start at the bottom, right? Because that is the core of it. So, there might have been, with the relational health, there might be issues of connection with the people around you, issues of security, right? Instability, trust, openness. Maybe your caretaker isn't necessarily the most open person, and that, kind of had an impact in your life. Maybe there was, issues of safety. And then as we move up, right, to the emotional health part, that creates issues of hopelessness for us, of self-regulation. Regulation is how we're able to regulate like the excitement in our bodies. So, and excitement can be good and, not so good. And regulations, our ability to kind of like work through that and like literally navigate through that. There might be issues of powerlessness, that is a result of our relational health. We might have issues with shame, fear, trust, different sensations, etc. And that's beneath the surface. And above the surface, we might, the outward behavior, it might be dissociation, right? Maybe if you, for example, like have experienced shame, so dissociation is a way that you might cope with it, right? Oftentimes we have a tendency to, as humans, to reenact traumatic events or reenact relationships that are traumatized. And that might be an outward behavior, right? So if we find ourselves thinking like, why do we go back to like people that are the same, in our romantic sexual relationships, that might be a reason. Or why do we, for example, maybe you have some like unresolved grief, and there's lack of concentration is the outward behavior that, comes out of that. So I want us to think about how all of these components are connected. Any questions about this iceberg? Again, I'm going to invite you to take a deep breath because there's a lot to take in. Okay. I want to talk to you about the trauma continuum. As I said before, trauma, and it's really the impact, and it's how it's based on our experience, on each person's perception of the event that led to that trauma. So it can really range from little t trauma, which is minor and temporary, to big T trauma, which is deeply wounding and life altering. I'm going to use the car accident again as an example, right? You know, for some people, that might be perceived and processed as little t trauma, and then for some folks, that might have like deeply life altering effect on them, right? And there's a lot of things that go into a lot of variables as to why people perceive things different, right? Age has something to do with it. If you were in a car accident as a little kid and there was loss experience through that, and that's going to be big T trauma for sure, right? Maybe if you're older, you know, you've had enough experiences driving where, you know, okay, not every time I go out and drive, that's not going to be my experience, right? Sometimes it might, we know that that's a risk, but it's not always going to happen. Then you are able to better rationalize that experience and like process it better, right? And so it really ranges from person to person. And again, it's really not on somebody who's not you to tell you where it is. Like, we know our experiences as well. The one thing that, you know, I've been sharing with folks as well, and is a reminder that there's this expression that we use in Lakeside, which is not all drama is trauma. And so to know, it's good for us to know the difference, right? It's really, it's kind of like shaky ground, because you know, where's the line between, you know, understanding ourselves enough to know what is little t trauma versus what is, you know, drama. That's, you know, as the expression says. So know that, yeah, it's shaky ground. And this is why, you know, like I said previously, this information more than anything is to set context and build empathy versus diagnosing, because that's not our job. And, you know, we're not necessarily certified or qualified to be doing those things. Okay. Oh, here we go. I've said this a couple of times, but it's a good. Yes. Drama with a D. Yes. You know, it isn't our job to diagnose our group members, so it's important to stay humble, right? The cool thing about trauma informed systems is that it caters to the most vulnerable people in the group, and everybody benefits from that. I just want to put that out there. Literally everybody benefits from a trauma informed system. You know, if we are catering to the most vulnerable people in our groups, then everybody is cared for, right? You know, this knowledge is really for you to facilitate with heightened awareness and compassion. As facilitators working with trauma impacted people, it is important for us to decenter and depersonalize our own experiences, which means it is our responsibility to care for ourselves and on our own time. So, for example, and you know, as I get deeper into my training and, you know, I begin, now my focus is shifting from teaching art-based skills to also facilitating a lot of trauma-informed work. You know, I'm having to realize how important it is for me to take the time to care for myself before and after, right? Whether it is making sure I eat breakfast, have the things that I need, feel good in my body, you know, sleep. I will take a nap after this. I'm letting you all know, as soon as I turn the computer off, it's nap time, right? But building that time in is important. If you're working with vulnerable communities and you know you might be hearing stories that are hard, that are heavy on the heart, etc., build that time in, right? And if I am able, oftentimes I try to build that into, you know, my fee, or you know what, like make that a part of the schedule, right? Because yeah, like that is part of prep work for facilitators, is literally like caring for yourself so that you are able to care for others. And that we're not projecting, right? When we hear people's stories, we're not like jumping in and story stealing, that we're actually making space for other people. And it takes a lot of practice to be able to decenter oneself and depersonalize, right? But as facilitators, like the job is to try to stay as neutral as possible. I'm gonna invite some self-reflection. So, and we can hold off to share some of these things until the end, right? But I want us to take a couple of minutes, and I invite you to reflect by just sitting and taking in the information and talking through it with yourself, by dropping in the chat box if you'd like, by writing it down on your journal, etc. Maybe recording a voice note. I want you to think about, so far, what is one thing about the principle of trauma that stands out to you, or the principles of trauma? Whoop, it is time for another brain break. Let's do it.
All right, we're good.
Thank you. All right. Yay, let's talk about some basic principles of facilitation. It's interesting because the way that I have been trained, and the way that I've learned about trauma-informed systems and modalities has been really divorced from principles of facilitation. And it's been interesting for me to draw connections between the theory and the application. And I have to shout out and thank the Bartle Foundation, because it was the first place where I did some training of this sort. And a lot of it was focused on the application of trauma-informed modalities within our education. And so by the time that I started the program at Lakeside, I already had a good understanding of how to apply those principles myself, and how to translate the theory into the application. But one thing that I found as a trained facilitator is that facilitation, just the way that it's usually taught, naturally is a great vehicle to, weave in some of these concepts, these principles, and these theories. So even though I'm an educator, right? Even though technically, I'm an adjunct faculty at some place, I'm a teaching artist at community schools, I always see myself as a facilitator, and I always approach everything I do from a facilitator's lens, because it is the way that I am able to best weave in what I've learned through my trauma competency training. And so I'm going to share some of the principles that I've learned about facilitation with you all. Thank you so much, Selena, for dropping that in the chat box. So parallel process is the idea that symptoms and attitudes of leaders are reflected in the group. So for example, if I were to have come in this morning and been like, oh, life sucks, it's the worst, whatever, then y'all, as people who are, some of you are meeting me for the first time, are like, wait. Is this person gonna facilitate a workshop about trauma? Like, that would have set a really bad tone for everybody, and created a lot of dissonance between the person who's transmitting the information and the people who are receiving the information, right? So I want us to think about how, as facilitators, it is kind of a responsibility to model for your group. This is not, how sometimes educators or people in our lives will be like, do as I say, not as I do. That's not the case here. We do as we say and do, you know, like we do as we just do it. We model for our people, right? We don't expect them to act differently from us because of the mirror neurons in our brain. You know, the people in our group are naturally going to just vibe off of what we're giving and mimic that, right? So if we are acting really apathetic, then that is the tone that we're setting, and people are likely to mimic that. And then if we're trying to stay, you know, honest and real and open, then that invites other people to do the same. So always model behaviors that you want to see for your groups. Principles of groups. I love talking about this because groups are like, you know, people. You know, groups have power, and we have seen, right, in society, all you have to do is open any news outlet. You know, groups have power, and that power can lead to good and to bad, right? So as facilitators of a group, it is important to come in with the intention of, how do we use the power that we have, right? As humans, we've survived this long because of our ability to work in groups. I'm going to put a gentle reminder out there that we are not particularly fast as a species. We're not particularly agile. We're not particularly strong, though we like to think that we are, right? You know, if it wouldn't have been because we move in numbers in the early days of, our evolution, then we probably wouldn't have made it, right? So always think about, how do I want to come into this? Like, what kind of impact do I want this group to have? And as a facilitator, oftentimes is your responsibility to think ahead and set those tones with the flexibility that, group members will have stuff to contribute, and that might change. Your mission might change, but, always good to think ahead and prepare. Groups vary as much as individuals vary. And groups tend to have personalities as well. So a big part of being a facilitator is opening up and being observant of those things, and also taking the time for reflection of, okay, this is how our group is navigating, so maybe if you need to shift a little bit, you do that, right? By changing maybe some of your community agreements, or by having open conversations. But, it is kind of on us to observe what the personality, how the personality is shaping up, and connect that to, is that allowing us to fulfill our mission, right? Groups need purpose. The strength of a group is really in what y'all are trying to accomplish together. Even if it's just, we're showing up to support each other. We're showing up to hear each other out, make space for each person to share their story, right? That's a purpose. But groups need purpose. So again, actually, this kind of leads us into the next one, which is, groups have life cycles, and it's okay for us to come into forming a group with that understanding. So those are the life cycles. Forming is the first time that y'all come together. Storming is when there is initial tension in the group, and norming is how you resolve that tension, right? Performing is when y'all as a group are fulfilling that mission or that purpose. And then adjourning is when the group dissipates. Oftentimes so storming, I want to go back to storming, is how we build our identity as a group, right? Tension and conflict is not necessarily bad. it brings up a lot of feelings for us individually, might bring up a little bit of stress, but it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Conflict is when there's tensions, maybe opposing ideas that come up, and then coming to a resolution is in that norming stage can actually strengthen the group itself, right? It can strengthen the relationships, and we experience that with relationships all the time. So, in those stages, it's okay to be open to that, and not resist it. And this could happen in a short-term project, right? Like you meet for the first time, everything's, Gucci is how I say, everything's good. And then the second time around, maybe something didn't sit well, and somebody held on to that till the next time. They came in the next time, said, hey, I don't really agree with how we're doing it. And then as a facilitator, I have to say, okay, let's talk about it. Like, what about it? What does this bring up for you? Et cetera, et cetera. Let's talk through it. Maybe I share like, where I was coming from, or et cetera, et cetera. And then we kind of come to a consensus of how do we set boundaries on both ends, or how do we come to some sort of resolution that allows us to become stronger. So I want to lift up, I believe I've always get stuck on the last name, but their first name is Prentice, and they are a trauma-informed individual as well. And I will find their IG and drop it in the chat box. And, they have this great quote that has gone viral a couple of times where, that it says, setting boundaries is how, you and I can love each other better, or something like that, right? And that's what I think happens, or can happen, during the storming and norming stages. And then the other part of group cycles that folks have a really hard time with is adjourning. So always, like sometimes with some groups, like we drag it on until like it's really done, but it's okay to anticipate a natural end, right, to a group. And understanding that closure of a group is as important as like the forming of the group. So groups are founded on human connection, and our survival has been dependent on human connection, as I said earlier. So thank you, Selena, coming through. So keep that in mind, right? I have this other really great quote that I share in other presentations, where it's, and I'm blanking on the person, but it's basically, anytime we come into teaching somebody, or sharing with somebody, or building with somebody, we have to be able to lead with that human connection, right? That's it. Like our human connections have literally been it's the reason why we've survived this long. So and sometimes that human connection means that you're inviting all of the feelings. So thinking about how you make space for that is really important. The first few minutes that a group spends together are really critical. So make sure that you're intentional about how you set that tone, right? If you're working with a community on a project, maybe you don't jump into that thing right away. Hopefully you have more than 2 hours, and you can like actually sit down and like ask some really great icebreaker questions, or maybe do a activity where folks get to know each other, right? And that will relieve tension with folks, because it's not necessarily easy to come into a space where you yes, boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously. Oh, such a gem, such a gem. So thank you for dropping that in there. Yeah, so like think ahead. What can you do to like really build those connections in the group, or facilitate them, right? Because sometimes there's only so much that you can do on your end, and then it's kind of up to everybody. But I find that a lot of people, the most nerve-wracking part of entering a group for the first time is not knowing who's going to be a part of it, not knowing what to expect. And so if you can clarify those things up front, then by doing introductions, by setting some community standards, then you're able to ease those anxieties. And the last principle of a group that I want to share is that 3 happens to be kind of like a magical number. So oftentimes it takes 3 meetings before a group can really gel, especially if those people don't know each other previously. And they're meeting each other for the first time. It really takes okay, you're a new person. Hey, what's up? Right. Then you come again and you're like, okay, I've seen you for a second time. I learned a little bit more about you, etc. And then that 3rd time, it's when we really start to settle into that familiarity. And so whenever possible, it is important for people to see each other more than 3 times. And the last thing is triangulation. So if you're ever breaking people up, 3s tend to be a tricky number because, for example, let's say 3s can be positive where, you have 2 people really affirming and lifting up another person. And then you can have a situation where 2 people disagree with the one person, and then the outlier feels attacked, or they feel left out. And so that may bring up some tension. So usually what I tell folks is, whenever possible, if you're doing, like, for example, trying to break people up for reflection, maybe 2s and 4s are more comfortable spots. Some notes on what it means to be an effective group facilitator from me and from, the perspectives of people who've trained me, is to be clear about your role. Again, clarity is kind, clear is unkind, clear is kind, unclear is unkind. There you go. Brene Brown. Follow Brene Brown, literally one of my favorite people. In my mind, we're best friends. She doesn't know that yet. Clarity is really important. Knowing yourself is important, but also knowing the group, what you want to get out of it, what your role is, being aware of who you are, the power that you bring as a facilitator, the way that people look up to you, the way that you need to model for your folks. All of that is really important. Having awareness of group members and the group process, right? And like I said, a lot of it is prep work, thinking ahead, maybe thinking of what ifs. What if there was to be tension because of this one exercise that I am planning? Or what if somebody resists, like thinking ahead, maybe trying to find out as much information as you can of your group members, or being specific if you're like putting out calls for people to join you. I don't know, like those things are important, right? If you want to be as open as possible, etc., right? And that there's going to be different kinds of people from all walks of life and different perspectives, then that's beautiful too. And you just account for that and you consider what are the possibilities and how do we make sure that we still build connection. So care for the individual group members and the group as a whole, right? So oftentimes we're in this predicament where we're kind of pushed to think about, there's individual group members with needs that maybe go against the grain or maybe create tension for the group as a whole. And so it's really a case-by-case basis, right? Like, I can't tell you this is how I would approach, or the group is always the most important, right? Because it depends, right? If there's a group and somebody experienced an attack on their personhood and their humanity, then I would say that person is the most important member at the moment, right? And that maybe the group needs to shift in order to support and accommodate everybody. But, maybe it's the inverse, right? And then in that case, the group is, most important. It really is like a case-by-case basis. And Oftentimes when things come up, they can be unexpected, and learning how to just create some space for yourself and maybe take time before you approach that might be important too. Again, how you approach this, it really depends on you, your comfort levels, the groups that you're working with, etc. So that kind of leads into the next one, right? Weighing the needs of the group versus the needs of the individual group members. And maybe that's even a conversation that you can have upfront with your group members is, okay, this is, all of your needs are important, and, they are important. And, the overall needs of the group is important as well. So how do we balance, right? There's a difference between prioritizing things and centering things. So usually you can prioritize things that maybe are opposing at the same time, without centering one or the other, right? So finding that balance between prioritizing the group's needs and the needs of the individual group members, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It is possible. It really just takes a lot of practice and thoughtfulness and openness, honesty with folks, and transparency in many ways. Encourage group responsibility to maintain a safe space. When people feel responsible for a thing, they feel more motivated to participate. And, so if we make it clear from the beginning, like everybody's safety is important, we can all ensure each other's safety, et cetera, then folks will feel like, hey, I need to step up, at all times to support. Being intentional about designing and upholding community agreements, right? So sometimes we'll set the community agreements at the beginning, and then we don't revisit them. I revisit community agreements every time, or every session, or every meeting, whatever. Or if I see somebody is, if I observe that somebody is not following through on the community agreements, it is my responsibility as the facilitator to remind folks, hey, we set these community agreements. If we need to revisit them, that's a larger conversation. But oftentimes, it is on us to be able to follow through, make sure that we're all following through with them, because there might be other community members who are being affected by the one person or the group of people who are not, following through with the agreements. And maybe they don't feel comfortable speaking up, right? So that's a way to support folks, and building trust without them having to feel like the responsibility of calling people in. Be gentle and firm when setting and upholding boundaries. It doesn't have to be something so dramatic, right? It can be as simple as a gentle reminder, or a, hey, maybe a reminder that I'm here and available for a conversation as a facilitator. If something's not working for you, check in with me so that we make sure that we're all still on the same page, right? And also recognizing that in order to for others to be calm, we need to maintain some calm, as much as possible. And that being said, all emotions are valid. The reality is, because of our mirror neurons, for example, as facilitators, if we get super agitated, we're likely to agitate our group as well. So having some techniques in our back pockets to how we move through tensions in the group is important, right? Whether it's taking that time to breathe, maybe doing a brain break, maybe having an extended break where people can go out their separate ways so that you can process and then come back together as a group and address tensions, that is possible, and something that you should think about. Allow the process of feedback and grow from it, right? And this is when I introduce the idea of accepting something without necessarily agreeing to it, right? So first of all, feedback is good. You know, understanding other people's experiences of the programs that you're facilitating or the meetings you're facilitating will help you adjust as necessary, right? And that's not a bad thing. So again, learn to depersonalize and decenter yourself, and not take it personal when feedback is being given, and at the same time understand that you can accept somebody's feedback without necessarily agreeing to it. You're, at the end of the day, we're all human, right? And when we feel those tensions come up in our lives, in our bodies, it's important for us to take the moment to question them and investigate them with curiosity. And so, even with me, like, hey, as an educator, I get evaluations, okay? And then sometimes students will say things where I'm like, I'm pretty sure I went over that. And I also have to take the moment to recognize, maybe I wasn't clear. Maybe I could have said a different way. Maybe I could have sent out a reminder, right? So when you feel those tensions come up, like, investigate them and know that you can accept a thing without agreeing to it necessarily. So I'm here like offering a couple of notes of, things that I remind myself before I go into space. It's important for me to be real, be me, remind myself I have to be nobody else but me. Maybe I curse less in front of, groups, but that's about it. Be transparent. I've got nothing to hide, right? And folks are usually more comfortable when there's transparency, especially if there's like institutional politics at play. Your group members can feel that, even if it's not being said. Be affirming whenever possible. Be affirming, but be specific about your affirmations, right? So if somebody said, y'all were affirming me earlier, right? And y'all were being really specific with those affirmations, and that made me feel good because I was like, that's felt, it's meant, it's I did a specific thing that led to the affirmation. So whenever possible, be affirming, but also like specific. Be clear, again, clear is kind, unclear is unkind. Know your place, know your power. As a facilitator, know that your group members are looking towards you to lead the example, or for clarity, or for whatever, and at the same time know that it's okay to not know, and to take a moment to say, hey, like, I mean, this happened to me earlier. I was like, hey, I blanked Saturday, it's a lot happening, and y'all came through. So that is something that you're able to lean into as well. Like, at the end of the day, you are human. Okay, active listening. Let's talk about it, because active listening is incredibly difficult. I'm a talker. I know y'all can already see that, right? And it's required me a lot of practice, and I'm still practicing. I'm still working on it to become a better active listener. There is a difference between listening and active listening. And there's a way in which you have to engage the idea of decentering and depersonalizing, while also engaging empathy and compassion. So it's like acrobatics that are at play as well. So active listening is a specific intentional form of communication in which the listener focuses their attention on the information being shared by the speaker and generates responses that reflect the content, feelings, or possible meaning of what the speaker is sharing. Okay. So when you boil it down, active listening is literally just reflecting what is being said. It's taking it in, acknowledging the person's humanity, acknowledging their personhood, acknowledging their experience, affirming that if you have the capacity to affirm that, and maybe reflecting back. It's actually, when you boil it down, it's pretty simple. It becomes hard in practice because of the ways that we have learned to engage with each other. So the outcomes of, and I'll go into more specifics in a second, the outcomes of Active listening is that you can build trust between yourself as a facilitator and your group members, right? Because it allows people to feel seen and heard, and you create opportunities for the group members. Oh, there we go, to feel seen and heard. So, rescuing is usually what we do when we listen, and a lot of you will probably have moments right now where you're like, oh, I do that. And as you're feeling those things, don't be hard on yourself. We all have tried to rescue each other, right? And so rescuing, this is again a Lakeside Global Institute acronym, so shout out to them. Rescuing, the R is for reassuring. So let's say, Selena, I'm gonna call you out. You came up to me and you're like, oh my God, I just tripped. And that sucked. I felt so overwhelmed after tripping or falling off my bike. And I'm like, oh, Selena, it's okay. It's okay. Like, you're gonna be fine. You're gonna heal. If you hurt yourself, it's fine. Reassuring. Sometimes maybe Selena just wanted to come up to me and say, hey, this happened, man. It sucked. And, maybe all Selena wanted is to feel like she was being heard. And instead of listening and affirming the experience, I jumped in and I said, you'll be fine. You'll heal, So that is the art. Explaining is, well, I'm going to use that same example. If I would have responded by saying, hey, maybe that happened because you weren't wearing the right shoes, or maybe, and again, maybe Selena is feeling like, does it matter that I was not wearing the right shoes? This still happens, right? And that's not comforting when you have somebody trying to explain all your feelings. And this is the hard one for me in particular, right? Especially with all that I've been learning, it is so, I have to catch myself because I want to explain to people right away, like, this is what's happening internally. And I want you to know that there's, and sometimes I have to like really turn that off so that I can realize my friends and the people in my life just want me to listen, right? Without having to tell them. They will arrive at that understanding on their own. And sometimes people will ask, people will be like, Candy, like, what can I do? And I'm like, all right, then I'll share. But oftentimes, like, jumping in without the consent of people wanting to receive your information, so know that if that's something that you struggle with, like, I'm here with you, and working on it. Solving, right? We feel like we want to solve because we love people, and hey, that's a part of it, right? We love people. We don't want to see them in pain. We don't want to see them struggling, and we would try to solve in the moment, like, oh my God, well, Selena, we're gonna get you a new bike. The solution can come with time, and like, it maybe that sharing moment wasn't about a solution. Maybe Selena's not ready for a new bike, and that's okay, right? Maybe she was at the stage where she needed to share, and that's it. And we have to learn to be okay with that. Sharing is kind of like what I mentioned earlier, which is story stealing, where then somebody, again, Selena, thank you so much for letting me use your name. It helps to explain. Where if, again, I fell off my bike and I were to jump in and say, oh, that happened to me yesterday, right? Then I'm taking away the attention from Selena and bringing it onto myself. It becomes not about Selena, it becomes about me, right? Or questioning, is when you say, are you sure you remember that correctly? Is that really how it happened? And the questioning part is always interesting for me because we really, it's why do we feel entitled to question people's experiences, right? Sometimes we do put ourselves in people's shoes and we're like, this, I would not have navigated it this way, or, etc. But, it takes practice, and it's important to learn how to take people's stories at face value, like how we said, how they shared without necessarily like dissecting and questioning and doubting. And this is true for all of our relationships, but this is like right now in this moment specifically true for when we work with other people, right? Again, we don't know everybody's stories. We don't know what they deal with in their lives outside of when we meet with them. So, it's on us to not just make all these assumptions about them. And then with rescuing, as you're probably already catching on, it's really more with when we try to rescue, it's more about us than it is about the other person. It's about self-soothing ourselves because we're uncomfortable with people's very real feelings and experiences than about just sitting with the discomfort and listening to them. Any questions about rescuing? Also, I'm being mindful of the time, y'all, and we are literally almost at the end. Almost there. Thank you so much for hanging in there. A couple of principles of active listening, be present. Again, being present has become more and more difficult because of the pandemic, because of all of the instability and the uncertainty. And sometimes we have to prepare in order to be present with people, right? Whether it's by caring for ourselves physically, emotionally, whatever. Be prepared to accept the feelings of the speaker. Again, accepting doesn't mean agreeing with, but when we're listening and where we're active listening, accepting is important. Be objective yet intuitive. So, be objective with what is being said, and also know that people communicate in ways that is not just verbal, right? So people's body language, maybe their shoulders are up by their ears because they are tense, or maybe people are being jittery, or maybe, the energy levels have gone down, right? Those are ways in which we can read in order to develop that, intuitive sensibility. Allow the speaker to be responsible for their own feelings, right? We are all responsible for our own feelings, really. Sometimes other people do a thing that triggers our feelings and triggers us in specific ways. Yes. And, like we also all have the capacity to manage those feelings. And so when people are sharing and being, open, vulnerable, there's very little that you can actually say to better their circumstances, right? Sometimes the most soothing thing for them is to literally just have somebody say, hey, thank you for sharing that. That must have been really difficult for you to say. And I see you, right? And that moment of feeling seen and knowing somebody really just heard me out, let me get it all out, sat there with me, even though it wasn't really comfortable, and acknowledged me as a person, that is oftentimes a huge respite that we're giving, because it actually is so rare to find. Let the speaker lead the conversation. And this is when I remind folks to not necessarily ask follow-up questions when people are being super vulnerable with you, right? Because, for example, like if somebody were to share something that like they're sharing for the first time ever, and then we ask a follow-up question, then we might be asking them something that they don't know yet, that they haven't discovered yet. So one thing that I always assume is that people are going to share as much as they're willing to share in that moment, and that's okay. And maybe they might come back next week, following day, whenever, and say, hey, I learned more. Can I share more with you? And then you have the opportunity to say, yeah, sure, like, please. And then, you're continuing to build that trust. But if that's not the case, then that's okay too, right? Like, it's important for us to remember that we're not necessarily entitled to people's stories. Just like other people are not entitled to our story. Be patient and allow the receiver to draw their own conclusions, right? All that I've been saying so far, and try not to have a specific result in mind. Again, that's really about putting the placing the power in the person who's speaking, and not taking that power ourselves. The keys to being a great facilitator is just a synthesis of everything I've already said. You know, structure, thinking ahead, right? Being specific and intentional, clarity, being clear, leaning into Brene Brown's teachings, consistency. Yeah, consistency. Consistency is actually really soothing for humans, because again, because our survival mechanisms are such that anything new and unexpected can be a little jarring, even if it's not necessarily like a full-blown anxiety inducing experience, but it can be pretty unsettling. So the more that you can give a notice ahead of time, or the more that you can be consistent, like that is always better for groups. And flexibility, right? Things happen, life happens, pandemics happen, and we just have to roll with that. And this is the last one before we do our last reflection. And I know that we are literally coming down to the wire. So on providing consistency, rituals are key, right? So entrance rituals, check-ins, sharing rituals, whether it's self-reflection, group reflection, combination of both, and exit rituals, right? A share out is my favorite exit ritual. And modeling for the group, here we go. Do as I say and do. Yes, modeling for the group is important. So this is our last bit of self-reflection before we get into the share out moment, which is just, you know, opening up a space for folks to share anything that you want to share, whether it's from your self-reflection or, you know, takeaways, etc. But I'm going to read this self-reflection question, stop sharing, maybe we'll stop recording so that we can open up the space in case folks just want to share out loud. I want you to consider the way that you already apply these principles of trauma-informed facilitation, and also consider the ways that you can incorporate these new principles into your practice.